In November of 1891, on the cold eastern edge of Wisconsin, a sawmill foreman stopped his wagon to stare at a house that looked like it had grown fur. The cabin was ordinary underneath, 18 feet by 22, fresh pine boards, a tin stovepipe, 2 small windows facing the lake. But John Callis was standing on a ladder, tying marsh reeds to the outside wall in thick, bristling bundles. Not a few bundles, not a decorative skirt, a whole second skin. By sundown, one side of the cabin looked less like a home and more like a sleeping animal buried in dry grass. The men from the mill laughed first. Then the farmers laughed. Then the fire captain came by, measured the growing wall with his eyes, and said the same sentence half the county would repeat before Christmas. That Estonian has wrapped his family in kindling. John heard them. His wife, Marja, heard them too. She kept handing him twine. The strangest part was not that he ignored the insult. The strangest part was that he seemed almost relieved by it, because the men laughing at the grass had missed the one thing he had crossed an ocean already knowing. The reeds were not the wall. They were only cages for the air, and if he could keep enough air from moving, the winter would lose the road it used to enter his house. John Callis had not come to Kewaunee County to become an inventor. He had come because land in America was supposed to hold still. That was no small promise to a man raised on the wet edge of Saaremaa, an island off the Baltic where wind pushed through reeds all winter, and people learned to build with whatever the marsh gave them. In his village, roofs were not merely covered with reed. They were tuned with it. The cut had to be made after frost, when the stems were hard and hollow. The bundles had to be tight, but not crushed. The slope had to lead water away. The thickness had to trap air without trapping rot. These were not theories to John. They were hand knowledge. He could feel a good bundle before he could explain one. But in Wisconsin, nobody cared what a reed cutter knew. The county trusted timber. Timber was wealth. Timber was strength. Timber was civilization stacked in boards. Ephraim Bell, the sawmill foreman who sold John the pine for his cabin, believed every good house began with more wood, thicker planks, heavier sills, tighter nails, more mass between a family and the weather. That was what everybody believed. Then came John's first winter by the lake. The cabin did not leak in a way a man could point at. That was what made it cruel. The walls looked solid. The door latched. The stove glowed. The roof held snow. And still the cold arrived as if the house had invited it in. By January, Marja had stopped removing the children's coats indoors. Their son, Tumas, slept with his wool cap tied under his chin. Their little girl, Ani, learned to warm her hands around a boiled potato before breakfast, because the tin cup at her bedside froze hard enough to split the rim. One morning, John found the family Bible bowed like a frozen board on the shelf nearest the wall. The paste in the binding had stiffened. The pages crackled when he opened it. Another morning, the sourdough starter Marja had carried from the old country died in its crock, not from neglect, but from cold. She stood over it with her hands folded in her apron and did not cry. That was worse. They burned 9 cords of wood and still lived in one small ring of heat around the stove. 6 feet away from that ring, water froze. 8 feet away, a man could see his breath. At night, John lay awake listening to the pine boards tick and shrink. Every sound felt like an accusation. He had built what the county said a proper cabin should be, and the proper cabin was failing his family. By spring, he had stopped blaming the weather. The weather was only doing what weather did. The mistake was the wall, the men of Kewaunee County fought cold like they fought a stubborn stump. More blows, more fuel, more force. John came from a place where force lost to water every day. You did not beat weather by shouting at it. You survived by understanding its habits. Warmth escaped his cabin in 3 ways. He did not use those words. He did not say conduction. He did not say convection. He did not say radiation. But his hands knew all 3. Heat ran through solid wood. Heat rode away on moving air. Heat bled into every cold surface that could receive it. The pine wall was strong, but it was also one long bridge. Every board gave warmth a path out. Every crack gave wind a path in. Every nail was a little iron road to January. The stove could make heat. It could not make stillness, and stillness was what John needed. In late August, he went to the marsh below the ridge, where the lake wind flattened the cattails, and the old reed beds stood yellow from the previous year's growth. He did not cut the green stems. Green stems held too much water. He chose the dry, mature reeds, the ones that rang faintly when tapped against his knife. Marja and the children spread them in the sun on old sailcloth. For days, the yard smelled of dust, lake mud, and cut stalk. The pile rose higher than the woodshed. Neighbors slowed their wagons. One boy asked if the Callis family planned to feed 100 cows. John only smiled and kept working. He built a wooden frame on 2 sawhorses to size each bundle. The reeds went in loose, his knee pressed down. Marja pulled tarred twine around the bundle. John twisted the knot until the stems locked together with a dry, hollow rasp. Bundle, tie, stack. Bundle, tie, stack. By the 2nd week, the Callis yard looked like a hay market. By the 3rd, Ephraim Bell rode over from the mill and leaned on the fence with 2 other men, enjoying himself before he even spoke. "You planning to thatch the roof, John?" "No," John said. "The barn?" "No." Ephraim pointed at the cabin. "Don't tell me you mean to put that swamp straw on the walls." John lifted a bundle to the battens he had already nailed outside the pine boards. The battens stood the reeds 3½ inches off the cabin wall. A hidden pocket. A deliberate emptiness. He fixed the bundle diagonally, slanting it across the wall instead of straight up and down. Ephraim barked a laugh. "You've laid it wrong. Rain will follow those stems and sit there till it rots." John tied off the bundle every 5 inches. Only then did he look down. "Straight reeds drink down," he said. "Slanted reeds shed away. That was all. No argument, no lecture. Just a sentence from a world Ephraim had never needed to imagine. The laughter changed once the wall grew thick. If Jan had hung a thin mat of reed, the county might have called it foreign and left it at that. But he did not hang a mat. He built an exterior sleeve nearly 30 inches deep. The window frames disappeared into tunnels. The door became a dark mouth set inside a shaggy wall. The little pine cabin vanished under a coat of hollow stems. Children called it the porcupine house. Men called it foolishness. Ephraim Bell called it worse. At the September meeting of the Volunteer Fire Company, he stood up and warned that the Callis place was no longer just strange. It was a danger. A chimney spark could lodge in the reed and burn the wall from the inside out. A hidden ember could smolder while the family slept. A wind gust could carry flame across 2 farms. The men voted without much debate. If the reed house caught fire, they would protect neighboring property first. They would not risk men inside a wall of grass. When John received the notice, he read it twice. Then he folded the paper and placed it beneath the oil lamp. Marja watched his face. "What will you do?" John looked out at the bristling walls that had made him the county joke. "Finish the outside. The next morning, he mixed clay from the ditch with sand, lime, and water until it made a thin, dirty wash. He brushed it over the outer face of the reeds, not enough to seal them dead, enough to skin them. The clay dried into a pale crust that turned rain, slowed sparks, and left the wall able to breathe. Ephraim Bell saw the coating and laughed again, but not as loudly, because by then, even he could tell. The reed sleeve was not random. It had order, it had thickness, it had drainage, it had a hidden airspace, it had an outer skin. It looked mad only if a man believed a wall had to be solid to be wise. What John had built was simple enough for a child to touch, and strange enough for a county to misunderstand. A pine cabin wall by itself resisted some heat loss. Not enough, but some. The reed sleeve did the real work. Each stem was a hollow tube. Each bundle held thousands of tiny chambers. Between the bundles were smaller pockets. Behind the bundles sat the 3.5-inch gap of dead air. To moving wind, the house now presented a maze. To heat trying to escape, it presented delay after delay after delay. Modern builders would later describe this with numbers. A typical pine wall of that thickness might offer the equivalent of only a modest thermal resistance. A thick reed assembly, properly dried and packed, could add several times that value. John's 30 inches of reed, combined with the air gap and the pine shell, made his little cabin perform less like a frontier hut and more like a deep insulated chamber. The exact number mattered less than the result. The old wall had allowed warmth to flee. The new wall made warmth wait. And in winter, waiting is everything. The test arrived in February. It began with a blue sky so clear that people trusted it. Then the wind died. The lake stayed open, breathing moisture into air that had turned viciously cold. By evening, every fence wire wore a white blade of frost. By midnight, the trees clicked like glass. For 9 nights, the temperature fell below 20 degrees under zero. The cold did not come as a storm. It came as pressure. It pressed against walls. It tightened leather. It turned water buckets into stone. It made the smoke from chimneys hang low and gray as if even fire had grown tired. Across the county, families moved their beds toward the stove. Blankets went over doors. Rags were pushed into window seams. Men woke at 2 and 4 to feed fires that seemed to eat without warming. At the Bell house, frost furred the inside wall behind the kitchen table. Ephraim's wife kept a kettle simmering just to make the room feel alive. In the schoolhouse, the ink froze before noon. At Amos Brill's farm, 2 piglets died in a straw pen 6 feet from a lantern. Everyone was suffering in the normal way. That was what made the callous cabin impossible. Inside the reed-covered house, the stove did not roar, it murmured. John banked it at night with 2 small split logs. By morning the coals were still alive. No frost grew on the inner walls. No draft moved the lamp flame. No water froze beneath the window. Marja restarted her sourdough in a clean crock and set it on the kitchen table. It rose. Annie walked across the floor in stocking feet. Tumas left his coat on its peg. And on the deepest sill of the east window, where every other cabin in the county would have kept its coldest air, Marja placed a small crock of cream. After the 9th night, the cream had thickened. It had not frozen. That crock became the first witness. The second witness came with swollen hands and a dying horse. On the 7th night of the freeze, Ephraim Bell's younger brother took fever in a bunk room behind the mill. By lamplight, the man's lips looked gray. The doctor lived 8 miles south, and the road ran open along the lake ridge. Ephraim harnessed his horse and left before midnight. Halfway there, the cold found the wet seam in his glove. Then it found his fingers. Then his face. His horse slowed under a crust of frozen breath, and the sleigh runners screamed over the hard snow. Ahead, across the dark field, a square of yellow light glowed from the Callis house. Deep inside the wall. Not on the surface, inside it. Ephraim hated that light. He hated needing it more. He turned into the yard and stumbled to the door. His hand would not close enough to knock, so he struck the wood with his wrist. John opened. For 1 second, Ephraim expected what every cabin gave in winter. A punch of stove heat near the fire, cold air on the floor, draft on the neck, smoke and damp wool. Instead, he stepped into a room that felt impossible because nothing in it fought him. The warmth was not hot. It was even. It was quiet. It touched his boots, his knees, his frozen cheeks, the back of his neck. The room had no corners of misery. Marja took his gloves without speaking and put dry wool mittens in his hands. Ephraim tried to say his brother needed the doctor, but his mouth was slow. John poured coffee into a tin cup and set it near him. Ephraim looked around while feeling returned to his fingers in painful sparks. The children slept under one quilt. The lamp flame stood straight. The cream crock rested on the windowsill, soft and unfrozen. A reed stem, cut open on the table, showed its hollow center like a row of tiny rooms. Ephraim reached for the pencil in his coat pocket to write the doctor's name. The pencil had frozen stiff. When he pressed it to paper, the graphite snapped. He stared at the broken point as if it had betrayed him. Then, in the quiet warmth of the room, the frost on the pencil melted. The wood relaxed in his palm. After a minute, it wrote. That was when the foreman stopped being angry. Not because John convinced him, because his own body had. Ephraim looked at the thick walls, then at the small fire, then at the man everyone had called foolish. I sold you good pine, he said quietly. John nodded. You did. Then why is my house freezing? John lifted the split reed from the table. Because pine is a road, he said. Air can be a locked gate. Ephraim frowned. It's grass. John touched the hollow stem. No, it is still air. The grass only holds the key. Ephraim stayed long enough for his hands to work again. When he left, John gave him a dry scarf for the road and walked out to check the horse's harness. The next morning, Ephraim reached the doctor. His brother lived. But that was not the story the county repeated. The story was that the loudest man against the Reed house had survived the cold by stepping inside it. By the time the thaw came, no one laughed from the road anymore. They came to measure. Ephraim came first with a carpenter's rule and a notebook. He wrote down the depth of the sleeve, 30 inches, the air gap, 3.5 inches, the tie spacing, 5 inches, the slant, a little steeper than 40 degrees. He pressed his palm against the inside wall and found it barely cool. Then he asked the question he should have asked in August. Will it rot? John took him outside after a rain. Water beat it on the clay skin, then ran along the slanted reed faces and fell clear of the wall. Where a small patch had been left exposed for inspection, the reeds beneath were dry by afternoon. Wet kills if it stays, John said. So do not let it stay. That spring, Pastor Ilmar Rod visited on his circuit through the lake settlements. He expected to find a curiosity. He found a method. John showed him the battens, the reed bundles, the clay wash, the gap between structure and sleeve. The pastor drew it all in a brown notebook, not because it looked beautiful, but because it could keep families alive. At the next gathering, he held up the drawing and spoke not of novelty, but of humility. He told the settlers that wisdom did not always arrive in the shape the county respected. Sometimes it arrived with a foreign accent. Sometimes it wore patched sleeves. Sometimes it tied marsh grass to a pine wall while confident men laughed from the road. By the following winter, 6 more cabins along the ridge had reed sleeves of their own. Not all were as thick as John's. Not all were as neat. But the pattern held: a wood frame for strength, an outer layer for still air, a gap to dry, a skin to shed weather, a wall that stopped pretending mass alone could save it. Families that had burned 10 cords cut back to 5 or 6. Children stopped sleeping in coats. Frost left the inside walls. A county that had trusted only lumber learned, slowly and grudgingly, that a house could be warmer because it was less solid, not more. That is the part that still matters. Jan Kallis did not discover insulation in a laboratory. He did not publish a paper. He did not patent a system. He did not have the vocabulary modern building science would later use. But he understood the principle under the language. Heat does not only leave through weakness, it leaves through paths. Give it a bridge, and it crosses. Give it moving air, and it rides. Give it metal gaps and exposed surfaces, and it escapes faster than a stove can replace it. But break the bridge, trap the air. Let the wall dry. Keep the weather outside the sleeve instead of inside the room. And a house changes, not because it becomes stronger, because it becomes calmer. Modern builders now use mineral wool, cellulose, foam board, rain screens, thermal breaks, and continuous exterior insulation to do with manufactured materials what John did with reed, twine, clay, and patience. They separate the structure from the weather. They protect the wall from moisture. They wrap the building in a layer that interrupts heat before it can run away. The material has changed. The wisdom has not. The men of Kewaunee County thought the marsh was waste. Something to cut around. Something to drain. Something that made land less valuable. John saw the same marsh and recognized a winter tool hiding in plain sight. The answer had been standing beside the lake the whole time, hollow and yellow, bending in the wind. The county built walls to resist winter. John built a wall that understood how winter moved. And that was the difference, because cold does not need to break down a house to defeat it. It only needs the air inside to keep running. John Kallis gave that air nowhere to go. He did not build a thicker cabin. He built a quieter one, and when the lake came for his family, the silence held.